Welcome back, AP Psych. Hope you're having a great day out there. We're on to our second to last video of our Unit 7, Cognition. We've talked about memory and all the parts and pieces and aspects of it and how we forget and construct memory and things like that. Now we're moving on to the actual cognition piece of this unit and how we think and how we form concepts in our mind, how we organize things, and how we use that information to then problem solve and figure out things we do in our daily lives. So let's go ahead and get started. First, cognition is just a fancy term for thinking, right? Thinking or cognition refers to a process that involves knowing, understanding, remembering, and communicating. So all of those things are involved in what we call cognition, right? And that's where we're going to go as we get started. It's important to note that we're not really talking about the cognitive perspective of psychology here. We're just talking about cognition in general. Later on, we'll get more into the cognitive perspective and how they might treat certain mental disorders and things like that. But for now, we're just talking about thinking or cognition. So first up, in terms of how we organize information in our minds, we have concepts. And these are mental groupings of similar objects, events, ideas, or people. And there are a variety of different concepts that we have. So here's an example. There are a variety of chairs, but their common features define the concept of a chair, right? We know what a chair is. You can probably form a mental image of a chair in your mind right now because you have a concept of it. You have this general category of knowing what a chair is. And even though many chairs have different features, they all fall into the same category, right? And some common features are seat, back, and legs, like a base. Some chairs rock, some chairs recline, right? Some are made for adults, some are made for children. But because of the concept that we have and the information that is contained in our concept, we understand what a chair is. So that's the first stage in organizing information in our minds and the way that we think. So how do we develop those concepts? We form some concepts by definition, like a triangle. I tell you a triangle has three sides, boom. Now you know what a triangle is and you can identify them. But mostly we form a concept by a mental image or a best example. Okay, so we call that a prototype. These prototypes are our best examples of a concept. So when we said chair, I'm sure something came to mind, right? You envisioned something, some type of chair. Whatever chair came to mind, that's your prototype. That's your best mental image. Okay, so if I asked you, what's your prototype of a bird? Is it this robin, penguin, or an ostrich? Well, when we think of birds, we probably think of, small animals with wings and a beak that can fly, right? So based on that concept, your prototype would be this robin, right? Because penguins and ostriches can't fly and they don't necessarily look like a bird or the bird that we come up with when we think of our prototype of a bird. So that's how we develop concepts. Our prototypes help us organize that information. Within our concepts, they are mentally represented as schemas. Okay, so you kind of have concepts, prototypes, and the schemas that define those prototypes and concepts. So they're generalized categories of objects, events, and people. It's like the characteristics and features that we think of when we think of a prototype within a concept. Okay, so these schemas help us further organize and recognize the different parts and pieces of how we put together things in our minds. And they help us understand what the concept is and often cause us to generate expectations about what that concept does. Okay, so like I said, it's the facts and the features and the characteristics of the objects in your concepts. So let's think about a police officer here for a second. So what is your prototype or mental image of a police officer? Think about that. Okay. What are some common features that they all have? So many of you are maybe thinking about a male who's wearing a uniform, maybe has a hat, a badge, a gun, right? Things like that. So as we develop a schema of police officers, we expect these things. We expect them to wear uniforms. We expect them to uphold the law and help people in need. So when we see them, that's what we think. And anytime we see something out of the ordinary, like an undercover police officer or something like that, that doesn't fit into our schema or our concept, and it can be confusing in the way that we think. Right? So that's how we develop concepts and organize information in our minds, right? We have concepts, prototypes, and schemas that provide all the information and help us realize what we're seeing and what we expect to see in our daily lives. Now, how do we use that information to then solve problems? So there are three ways that we solve problems once we have information organized and we're learning these things, we learn how to deal with certain issues and problems. First is an algorithm. I'm sure you've heard about these in math class. If you use the algorithm, you know you're going to get it correct, right? You know you're going to solve the problem correctly. Well, it's a methodical, logical rule or procedure that guarantees solving a particular problem. Okay, so an algorithm will always come up with the correct answer because it exhausts all possibilities before arriving at a solution. So potentially it's going to take you a long time, but you know you're going to be correct. So that's the benefit. Computers use algorithms and they can run through algorithms much more quickly than humans. But here's a very basic example for people. Let's say you wanted to find oatmeal at the grocery store. So you use an algorithm. So what does that mean? You're going to search every aisle, walk up and down every aisle until you find the oatmeal. And you know you're going to find it that way by walking up and down every single aisle. So algorithms are foolproof, but they can take a little bit longer. In opposition to algorithms are heuristics. And I want you to think of these as like mental shortcuts. Okay, they're a simple thinking strategy that often allows us to make judgments and solve problems more efficiently. They enhance the likelihood of success, but they cannot guarantee it. So there's your difference between algorithms and heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that can get us to a solution faster, but they're not always correct, whereas algorithms are. Okay, so they're a little bit more error prone. So here's the example going back to the grocery store. If we're trying to find the oatmeal, instead of using an algorithm and going up and down every aisle, you use a heuristic and you think, I'm going to read the signs at the end of the aisles, and I'm going to go down the cereal aisle first because that's most likely where it's going to be, right? And usually you'd be correct. What happens when you go into a grocery store and for some reason they put the oatmeal in the baking aisle, right? You have a chance of there being an error and maybe missing something as opposed to an algorithm. But that's a heuristic, our mental shortcuts that get us to solutions more quickly. Our last one is insight learning. And insight is also a way to solve problems. So we talked about this in our Unit 6 on learning. It involves a sudden novel realization of a solution to a problem, right? Remember when we talked about Wolfgang Kohler and his chimps and how they solved these problems of getting their bananas? You'll often need some prior experience and a little bit of initial trial and error to gain some insight. But insight can happen in humans and animals, and it's that like, boom, aha moment. You're like, oh, I got it. I got the answer. I'm ready. I can solve the problem. And they call it insight in that aha moment because they've done a lot of brain imaging and EEG studies that suggest when insight strikes, it activates your right temporal lobe. And the time between not knowing and knowing the solution is 0.3 of a second. So it really is like light bulb, boom, I got it now, right? You've solved the problem through insight. Okay, so now we know how we organize information in our minds and how we think through problems to solve things, but there are some obstacles in our problem solving and the way that we think that can get in the way. Okay, so one example is something called fixation. And this is our inability to see a problem from a fresh perspective. Okay? It's impediment to solving problems, right? We don't have a fresh perspective. We need to step back. And sometimes that's why people say, hey, sleep on it and wake up in the morning. Maybe you won't be as fixated on the issue or fixated on the solution that you think will work, and you'll have a fresh perspective, right? But fixation is a major obstacle or impediment to solving problems. And there's two types of fixations. So there's mental set. We've talked about perceptual set in the past. They're similar, but mental set is an obstacle in problem solving. So it's a tendency for our old patterns of problem solving to persist and make it impossible for us to see new ways to solve the problem. Okay? So it's when you try the same thing over and over and over and you won't change it up because your mental set says this is the way I should solve the problem. This is the way it should work, but it doesn't. Okay? Another fixation is functional fixedness. And this is our tendency to think of only the familiar functions for objects and not see them in unique ways that may solve the problems that we're experiencing. Okay? So, example, let's say you're at a hotel and you forgot your hairbrush and all you have are nothing aside from, some utensils from forks or something like that from the kitchen at the hotel. Most people are not going to use those forks to comb their hair, right? I know I certainly wouldn't. But in The Little Mermaid, she uses a fork to comb her hair because she's never seen a fork before, right? And the way it's shaped, it does have some use for that. So, getting rid of your functional fixedness and saying, yes, I can use a fork for this would be a way to solve a problem. Or let's see you've lost a screwdriver and you need to tighten some bolts. Well, why not use like a dime or a very skinny piece of money, right? Can turn that bolt to tighten it. So thinking of things that can solve problems that you're experiencing that normally wouldn't do that job. That would show your lack of functional fixedness. If you don't solve those problems, it's probably because you are experiencing some type of functional fixedness. Next up, we have something we're probably all a little bit familiar with, confirmation bias. And this is a tendency to search for information that confirms a personal bias. Okay, so this will differentiate it from some terms coming up later. We are searching for information that confirms what we already believe. Right? We seek to support ideas and tend to dismiss evidence that is contrary to our way of thinking. We don't even pay attention to it. We're not even taking it in. We're only viewing the stuff that backs up what we think or what we believe. So, for example, imagine that a person holds a belief that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. Whenever this person encounters a person that is both left-handed and creative, they're going to place greater importance on this evidence and support their already existing belief. This individual might even seek proof that further backs up this belief while discounting examples that do not support this idea. Okay? We see this a lot today, especially in social media. People are performing confirmation bias all the time, searching for articles that back up what they believe and not taking in both sides of an issue. Continuing, so we talked a little bit about heuristics earlier and how they can help solve problems and be more efficient ways to get to a solution. However, if you misuse heuristics, they can also lead to bias in our judgment. Okay, and Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman were two major psychologists who study heuristics and their judgment issues and misuse. First, we have something called a representativeness heuristic. And this is judging the likelihood of things or objects in terms of how well they represent or match a particular prototype. Okay? It allows people to make quick judgments. This is very similar. You should think of stereotyping here, right? How well does this seem to represent or match a particular prototype? Well, it's a little bit of stereotyping. So here's an example. If you were to meet a man dressed in dress slacks and a sweater who is smaller in stature, wears glasses, pretty soft-spoken, and somewhat shy, and then you're asked if this man were a librarian or a construction worker, what are you going to say? I mean, based on your prototypes and your particular ideas about a construction worker and a librarian, you're probably going to say librarian based off of his features. However, the probability is that he's a construction worker just by sheer number, right? So there are some errors in the way that these things help. But again, they're mental shortcuts, like we said earlier. They can help us solve a problem faster. But we have to be careful of any biases or things that creep in when we're doing this, such as representativeness heuristic. The second is availability heuristic. And this is a cognitive shortcut in which the probability of an event is determined by how easily the event can be brought to mind. Okay? So you choose the alternative that is most mentally available. Okay? So if I ask you, are you more afraid of dying in a plane crash or in an auto accident? Despite the fact that more people die in auto accidents than in plane crashes do receive much more publicity and they are so much more readily brought to mind that you're going to be more afraid of that. Similarly, example, if I asked you, are you more afraid of sharks or cows? People are going to tend to say sharks, right? Because they hear about shark attacks and things like that. But more people die every year from cows falling onto them than they do in shark attacks, right? So how easily things can be brought to mind may impact the way that you think about them. Another example of issues in problem solving is overconfidence, a tendency to overestimate the accuracy of one's beliefs and judgments. Okay? So think about like the last project you had in school and how long you thought it would take. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh man, it'll take me a half hour. I'll be done. And then you get home and it's an hour and a half later and you're like, I'm still not finished with this. Oh my gosh, right? It's because you're a little overconfident about your ability and your belief. Now, while overconfidence does pose some problems for making decisions, it's actually associated with more happiness and making tough decisions easier because thinking everything will work out can keep us from worrying. So while overconfidence, we need to be aware of it and not be too confident in ourselves, it is also a benefit in just general life happiness. Okay, a couple other things. Framing decisions, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but how an issue is presented can significantly affect decisions and judgments. Right? So framing the exact same issue in two different ways can produce two very different results. If you frame it in a more positive way, more people are going to respond to it. More negative, it's going to be worse, right? So here's an example. If you're talking about ground beef at the store, we've all seen ground beef at the store, right? Or yogurt at the store. What's the best way to market it? Hey, this ground beef has 25% fat. Or is it 75% lean, right? This frozen yogurt's 20% fat, or it's 80% fat free. Okay? Which one are you more likely to buy? The one that sounds more positive, right? If I told you had to get surgery and the doctor told you there's a 10% chance of death with this surgery, you're going to be like, whoa, I'm out. No way, right? But if they frame it as, hey, it has a 90% chance of success, it makes you feel good. You're much more likely to go through with it. And so framing has a big impact on the way we think about things and the judgments that we make. A couple more problems with our beliefs. We have two things that sound very similar here. So we have belief bias is the tendency for our pre-existing beliefs, our biases, to distort logical reasoning, and sometimes by making invalid conclusions. Okay? This is a situation where you can't set aside your prior knowledge to accept a new conclusion. Okay? We talk about that in Psych and being very important and how you can set aside your prior beliefs so you can accept new results. Belief bias is not doing that, right? So here's an example. You're supporting this political candidate and you're like, you love them, they're great, they're going to win. And the day before the election, they're arrested for fraud and election issues, right? But you say, no, can't be right, can't be right. I love them, they're an upstanding person, they have to have been framed, right? And you persist in your belief and you ignore logical reasoning that says otherwise, right? Your belief, you can't let go of what you previously believed, right? Belief perseverance is our tendency to cling to our beliefs in the face of contrary evidence, okay? So in this situation, you're actually being presented with information that contradicts your belief, but you're ignoring it, right? You're saying, nope, I don't believe that. If you believe that smoking does not cause cancer and you continue to believe that, despite this mountain of evidence that you're presented with that points to smoking being a clear link with cancer and early death, okay? So the difference between belief perseverance and confirmation bias. In confirmation bias, you're actively seeking out information that backs up your previous biases. In belief perseverance, you're ignoring information that's being presented to you so you can continue to believe what you want to believe. Okay. All right, so that was a lot of new terms that we just introduced there, a lot of examples potentially to help you with your vocab, and we will differentiate all these again in class to help you be able to organize them in your mind and go from there. So hopefully, if you have any questions, you'll let me know, and I'll see you in class.